Welcome to a bonus episode of Sistery History, Hans Holbein, A Sensory Perspective. In this episode, we're back at the Queen's Gallery, Buckingham Palace, visiting another of their brilliant exhibitions, Holbein at the Tudor Court. Here we talk to Kate Hurd, exhibition curator and also senior curator of prints and drawings at the Royal Collection Trust. Now, we knew that Holbein was good, but we didn't appreciate just quite how good until we got up close to his paintings and drawings, something this exhibition encourages you to do. The realism, the textures, the eyes, even the eyebrows draw you in. So much to study and admire, and luckily for us, lots of sensory aspects to explore. Not just in the works themselves, but in the artistic process too. Let's begin. Hi Kate, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm Laura, and this is Caroline.
Hi.
Before we begin, we'd like to say thank you for giving us your time and your expertise today. And speaking of expertise, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your role at the Royal Collection Trust?
Yes, I'm Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings, which means I'm one of the curators looking after the fantastic collection of prints and drawings in the Royal Collection, which includes the amazing works by Holbein we can see on the walls around us here in the exhibition.
That means we're in very good company. As you know, our specialism at Sistery History is sensory history. We're staying true to form and have tailored our questions to focus on the sensory aspects of Holbein's works and also his methods. But let's start off with some context, if we could. What inspired the exhibition?
The Royal Collection includes one of the greatest groups of works by Holbein, and the exhibition celebrates those works, and it celebrates Holbein as a brilliant artist and his working practice and his skill as a portraitist.
And how long did it take to prepare?
It took a few years. Exhibitions take 2 or 3 years at least to prepare. This one we started during lockdown and then worked on it at an increasing pace after that.
Is it harder to prepare an exhibition during COVID and lockdown?
It is, because you want to look at the works of art, and particularly this exhibition where we're thinking about the detail and looking closely at Holbein's works and understanding how he put them together. It was a real joy to get back to be able to looking at the drawings again, to look at the paintings. So really nice to come face to face with the works again.
That makes complete sense. As we were looking round the exhibition just before we talked to you, often we were leaning in to look at the details because they're so incredible, aren't they?
They are, and that's exactly what it's great if visitors want to do, to look closely, to enjoy those details, because Holbein is the most exquisite artist, and it's his technique and his skill that's such a joy. Looking closely is a wonderful thing.
Now, I'm sure many of our listeners will know Holbein in relation to portraits he painted during his time at Henry VIII's court, the royal family, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, etc. But his earlier life and works might be less familiar to them. Could you give us a quick biography to help set the scene?
Yes, Holbein is the son of an artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, and he comes from an artistic family, so a family of painters. And we think that he and his older brother Ambrosius trained with his father in Augsburg, where they were born, and trained as painters, painting panel paintings, altarpieces, portraits. And in around 1515, they moved to Basel in Switzerland to pursue their own careers. We think that Ambrosius died around 1519. He disappears from the record at that point, but Hans Holbein makes his name in Basel, working for the city elite, designing house facades, these wonderful illusionistic paintings on the front of houses that show people and horses leaping that appeared real. And Holbein is brilliant at that sense of illusion, that ability to make a flat painting appear as if it's alive. And again, looking around us, these figures painted in their frames on the walls look as if they would turn round and talk to us and step out of their frames. I occasionally come into the gallery when there's no one else here, and it still feels like it's full of people. You feel that you're surrounded by these figures from the 16th century, and they really do appear right there. Holbein also designs panel paintings, book designs, and in 1524 he travels to France. We don't know why he goes to France, but we think he might have been looking for a court position, because he clearly has ambition as well as talent. And that, for some reason, doesn't pay off for him. He comes back to Basel very soon afterwards. But in 1526 he makes a second journey in search of work, and that's to London, which is where the exhibition starts.
About how old was he when he made his first trip to London?
He will have been in his late 20s. We think he was born in 1497, so around 29.
So that means that when he moved to set up in Basel with his older brother, he would have only been about 18?
He was looking to set up as an adult on his own, really. He was looking to make his career. Having been trained by his father, he must have been looking to establish his own practice with his older brother, so there were the two of them. But Holbein is clearly ambitious, and he's clearly has this brilliant ability, so he will have done it with confidence, I think.
That's amazing to have that confidence and that drive at that age. Holbein's probably best known for his portraiture, but you've already alluded to house painting, which sounds incredible to be able to work at that sort of scale. And we know that he designed jewellery and decorations, tableware, metalwork. How common was it for an artist to have such a range of skills?
You're absolutely right that Holbein works at great scale and at very small scale too. He was doing what was typical of a court artist at the time, which is painting portraits, but painting anything that was required of him. So he did those wonderful designs for jewellery that you see in the British Museum, designed metalwork. His versatility is really illustrated by the practice of miniature painting, which we think he only learned in England from the Flemish miniaturist Lucas Hornbout. But if you look around the exhibition, you can see just how brilliant his miniatures are, how he very, very quickly takes that new skill and runs with it and creates these really exquisite, tiny paintings.
The miniatures are beautiful, aren't they? The colours are vibrant. Are the surrounds, the frames, originals?
No, the frames are later. The frames are Victorian,
okay. Yeah.
Were added by a man called Hatfield for Victoria and Albert. So miniatures may have been placed in boxes or other sorts of frames, but the ones you see are not Holbein's original frame.
In my head, I'd imagine something a little bit smaller, but these still, you could have held them in the palm of your hand, couldn't you?
They'd have been cased in some way, and miniatures that survive sometimes are in boxes, sometimes smaller ones are in lockets or, sort of to be worn. But miniatures are absolutely right, they're to be handled. They're very, very personal and private in a way that a painting hung on a wall might be seen by many people. You could choose who you wanted to show a miniature to. And I think that drawing of Anne Boleyn, which is so much debated, I think it is Anne Boleyn, I think it's very likely that it was a drawing for a miniature, and that Henry VIII, you can imagine this besotted Henry VIII holding Anne Boleyn in his hands and looking at her, and then we think about Holbein and his ability to conjure people up as if they're right there, and you can see why he was chosen for that task.
So they were intended to be touched frequently, very personal to the person
to
who
be
owned
handled.
them.
Yeah.
Kate, after his time in France, what drew Hans Holbein to the Tudor Court, and how long did he spend here?
There was a carrot and a stick. The stick was the Reformation. We know that in Basel, by the mid-1520s, the Reformation had meant that there were episodes of iconoclasm in the city, which meant that religious works of art were being destroyed. And it's not so much that works of art are being destroyed, but that people aren't commissioning them, because you don't want to commission an altarpiece, a stained glass window, and then find that the next week it's been ruined. So artists in Basel are starting to run out of work. And we know that the Basel artists petition the city council to say that they are struggling. They're struggling to feed their families. And we know that a number of artists across Europe at this time changed their jobs because they couldn't get the work. So Holbein was looking for work in England. And we know that from letters written by Erasmus, who writes to say that he's looking to earn money. But there's also the carrot, which is the Tudor Court, which is a vibrant court where artists from across Europe are finding success because Henry VII and then Henry VIII want to establish themselves as major players on the European stage. They arrange marriages across Europe, and portrait artists are therefore employed to paint pictures as part of those marriage negotiations. So Holbein is one of a number of artists who moves to England because it seems a fertile ground for him to find work. And he moves to England very specifically because he's undertaken work in Basel for Erasmus and Erasmus's publisher Johannes Froben. And Erasmus writes him a letter of introduction to Sir Thomas More, one of the senior courtiers in England. And we've got these wonderful drawings of Thomas More, of Thomas More's family, that were commissioned soon after Holbein arrived in England, on display in the exhibition. And Holbein was in England pretty much for the rest of his career. He went back to Basel between 1528 and 1532. But otherwise, he's in England, making his career here.
He was here to stay.
He was.
So we're going to move on to some sensory-specific questions about the works that we see here today. What do we know about the surroundings that Holbein preferred to work in? What was it like in his studio? Was it noisy? Do we know anything about that?
Those are fantastic questions, and we have absolutely no idea about Holbein himself. We don't know if he had a studio, where that studio was, who he worked with. We don't have any information at all. For such an amazing artist who was so successful in the 16th century, there's a lack of documentation. But artist studios would usually have been busy places. Think of Albrecht Dürer, who has a number of apprentices working on panel paintings. I can imagine Holbein's studio was busy because of the rate of production, certainly after he comes back in 1532. Whether he was working by himself or with others, he must have been working on a number of different projects at the same time. You could imagine him being busy, moving from one to the other. There would have been visitors. I mean, we don't know if he went to his clients to take their portrait or if they came to him, but there might have been someone sitting for a portrait, or he might have been on the road. We know he owned a horse, so we know he travelled around, but we have no specific information. That's all guesswork.
Were there any smells that would have been common to an artist's studio? Because there was part of the exhibition in one of the side rooms talking about the tree sap, animal glue, chemical reactions, linseed.
So it's the most fantastic question. I mean, thinking about how the painter's studio would have been so full of, we've talked about noise and obviously colour and visual stimulation, but also just smells is fascinating. Something I've been talking to my colleagues in conservation about. And you're absolutely right. There would have been all sorts of smells. The paintings are on wooden panels, which were probably worked before they came into the studio, but I don't know whether they were sanded down, so there'd have been a smell of wood, and Holbein tends to use oak in England, so there's a smell of oak. Linseed oil, pine resins used in the paints. Rabbit skin glue would have been terribly smelly and was used in a number of...
Nice.
It doesn't, but would have been used in the preparations for the drawings as well as paintings. In his miniatures, he'd have used honey. Now, that smell wouldn't... I mean, that's for the gold. Smell wouldn't have overpowered rabbit skin glue, but it would have been there. Imagine also candles burning, lamps burning. Some of his blacks are made from charcoal or that sort of burnt carbon. Yeah, it must have been quite something.
Would the paintings themselves smell when they were completed?
They don't smell now. 500 years later, I've got quite close to these, and that's been what we've talked about, getting close. I mean, they don't. But at the time, you can imagine, you talked about those side rooms, which are wonderful. My colleagues in conservation have showcased their work there on looking into Holbein's working practice and the materials he used and how they've gone about analysing that. And you'll have seen one of the discoveries my colleague, the head of paintings conservation, made when she worked on the painting of Derek Bourne was a thumbprint, where the panel has been lifted up, probably by Holbein himself when the paint is still wet, because paint takes a long time to dry.
How about sound? How does this artist convey sound, or indeed the absence of it, in his works?
In all sorts of ways. I mean, you do hear things when you look at Holbein's paintings, partly because he dresses his sitters so richly and so brilliantly evokes fabric and the stiffness of velvet and the softness of fur and the sort of richness of cloth of gold, that it's impossible not to think of those fabrics as real fabrics and hear them rustle and creak, that sense. So Henry Guilford's wonderful fur collar, you get the texture of that fur, you get the cloth of gold that he wears glistens and glows, and Holbein's used gold, so they are very tactile works. But there is a particular painting in the exhibition in which Holbein has talked about the absence of sound. And that is the portrait of Derek Bourne, which is the final portrait in the exhibition. That's the one where the thumbprint was found. And there's an inscription at the bottom of that by Holbein saying, "All this painting lacks is a voice to appear alive." So Holbein is sort of saying all you're missing is speech. And it's an advertisement of his own brilliance. It's saying I can make people appear so lifelike that you expect that they're going to speak, which you do. But he's also saying that this is what this portrait is missing, is sound. And it is the most lifelike portrait. You could imagine Derek Bourne talking to you. But Holbein, I think, must have been very aware of that and aware of what he was producing and what his figures just needed to be these living, breathing people.
He knew he was good.
He definitely knew he was good. I mean, he had that confidence. We talked about the confidence. He has that confidence to travel to Basel, to travel to England, and to become King's painter. But it was a well-placed confidence. You know, he could do it. He knew he was good, you're right.
I noticed that some of the sitters are looking at us, but not very many, and the majority are looking away, even if only slightly away. Does the direction of sight signify anything?
That's a wonderful question. There are a number of different answers. The first is that Holbein clearly thinks very carefully about how he poses each of his sitters. And you can see that if you look at the two drawings of Henry Howard in the Red Gallery, because Holbein has started a portrait with Henry Howard facing slightly off to one side and has abandoned it quite quickly and has worked up another portrait with Henry Howard facing the front. And when you look at the two, it's a very much more successful composition when Henry Howard faces the front. So Holbein probably started that first drawing and then thought, this pose is not working, and stopped and started again. So Holbein is thinking about what will make the most successful picture. But just behind you is a drawing of a man called John Poyntz. And Poyntz is fascinating because you can see that he's sort of looking slightly over his shoulder and he's looking up, very sharply up. And he must be looking at something. And we don't know what he's looking at. The finished painting is lost, but he's got such a distinctive pose that he must have been posed that way to look. It's been suggested maybe at a Virgin Mary or a devotional figure, which would make a lot of sense. And for other of the sitters too, next to John Poyntz is his nephew Nicholas Poyntz, who's shown in very sharp profile. And it's been plausibly suggested that that is because of classical coins and medals. And when you look at Nicholas Poyntz's seal, it's a classical hero, a man in a helmet, posed very much like that. So all of these poses will have had a meaning. Often we just don't know what that meaning is. But it's going to be a balance of Holbein the artist thinking about what will be best for his painting and what surrounded the sitters and references that were being made.
The preparatory drawings that we have of the Moore family, was that meant to be a group painting?
It was, and that again is a really interesting example of how Holbein works. It's one of his earliest commissions in England. It's a group portrait of Thomas More and his family. The finished painting is lost, it was destroyed by fire, but we have those wonderful individual studies which are in the Royal Collection, of which a group are on display, and a drawing in Basel which shows the arrangement of all the figures. And when you look at them, you can see that Holbein has posed his individual figures as they will appear in the finished painting. So that's a really good example of how Holbein's thinking about pose and how people will appear.
The reason that I asked about the Moore family was that we noticed that in each of them they were looking in a different direction. So there was no two that were looking in exactly the same direction.
Yes, they all interact in the finished painting. They look in different directions. One lady points out to something in a book that Thomas More Senior is holding. But they all interact, but they do all look in different directions. And that's Holbein thinking about the finished composition.
Yeah.
Where and how do we see changes in tastes or trends reflected in Holbein's art? Can we see that through this exhibition?
We can. Holbein is a great source, actually, for dress and dress history and changing fashions. So if you look around the exhibition, you can see a number of different headdresses, you can see a number of different hairstyles, you can see different fashions for beards. So that sort of fashion, but also the antique fashion. And this increasing taste for the classical, which came in with the Renaissance, which Holbein is aware of, which is a sort of stylistic idiom that he works in. And you can see that around the exhibition. Nicholas Poyntz, who's the gentleman who's in profile, thinking about classical coins. You can see some of Holbein's book designs are based on antique motifs such as putti and swags and all this sort of thing. So you can see Holbein's awareness of European continental artistic fashions as well as that sort of dress history that's so interesting. I mean, whether Holbein was setting the fashion to a certain extent is really interesting. He was designing jewellery, he was designing metalworks, he was certainly working in those motifs which were of real interest to the cutting-edge patrons at court.
In your opinion, which piece in this exhibition speaks most to the senses and why?
I think it has to be that portrait of Derek Bourne, the young merchant who has such confidence. For so many reasons, it has that inscription talking about this portrait just lacks sound, it just lacks a voice, and then it has everything you need to appear alive. But It's also the most exquisite painting of fabric. Derek Bourne is dressed entirely in black, but the different textures that Holbein conjures up just through different shades of black and white, the satin and the fur and the velvet, is just exquisite. And it's a portrait which has recently been conserved. It's the first time it's on display since its conservation. And Nicola Christie, who undertook the conservation work, discovered a great deal about Holbein's working practice, looking beneath the layers of his paint. So again, that sort of sense of getting further with understanding Holbein. But I think all of the works in the exhibition are more than just visual. They all have textures and sort of the experience is more than just looking. But for Derek Bourne, that's more than anything, that sense of the voice.
So shall we have a look at some of our favourites from the exhibition then?
Oh, absolutely.
Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. What can you tell us about this one?
This is a fantastic painting. It's on a green background. It shows Thomas Howard, who's one of the most senior figures in the country. He is the Duke of Norfolk, but he also holds 2 posts at court. So you can see he's holding the white baton of the Lord Treasurer and the gold baton of the Earl Marshal. Those 2 batons signify his status.
Ah, okay.
But his status is also signified through the most incredible fabrics that he wears. So he's got that lynx fur lined cloak, and underneath it that beautiful satin. You can feel the softness of the satin and see the light bouncing off it as it folds and creases. We know a little bit about Thomas Howard. He got into terrible trouble towards the end of Henry VIII's reign and was arrested for treason. Ooh. And they took inventory of his home of Kenninghall in Norfolk at that point. So we know that the collar he's wearing, which is recorded in the inventory, was studded with diamonds. I find it fascinating, if you look around the exhibition, Holbein's other sitters are often wearing rings, are wearing hat badges, are wearing jewellery. You can see he's wearing none of that. He only has very slight decorations. You can see these little tags on his cloak, which were there to fasten it. But it exudes power entirely through the way Holbein's painted it.
The fabrics are incredible, aren't they? I mean, I can count maybe 5, 6 obviously different fabrics.
Yeah.
You've got the furs, you've got the more silky things, you've got the lace collar.
Yeah.
And the difference between them is...
Yeah, and the way he's painted, if you look at the fur over the shoulder, Holbein is incredible at fur. He's able to create, with this sort of flicks of the brush, this sense of these long hairs and the softness of it. It's the most incredible piece of painting.
So, Kate, we're standing in front of my favourite, The Merchant of the Steelyard. I chose this one because I can almost hear what he's doing. Can you tell us a bit about this guy?
Yes, I can tell you a lot about him and nothing at all, because we don't know who he was. His identity must have been apparent to contemporaries, and there are a number of clues to his identity in the painting, but we can't read them. We can't sort of solve those clues at the moment. One day we will. But looking at him, he's clearly a merchant. You can see he's cutting the string on the letter he's holding in his hand. He's leaning his arm on a table. On that table are some coins, signifying again his trade as a merchant. His seal with his merchant's mark, which really should tell us who he is, but we can't tie it up with anything. A key just over to the corner, which signifies that he deals in expensive goods, that he needs to be able to lock things up. And a sheet of paper and a quill with a lovely ink-stained tip that has got writing on it. This is a wonderful piece of writing because it's dated July 1532, and this gives us the date for Holbein's return to England after he went back to Basel. So we call him a merchant of the Steelyard because the letter that he's holding is clearly addressed to a merchant of the Steelyard. And the Steelyard was an enclosed trading compound in London where merchants of the Hanseatic League could trade under special privileges. Mm-hmm. But his name is beyond us.
I chose this painting because you can almost hear the scratching of the pen. You can hear the clinking of the coins and that tiny bit of string that's just about to break with that knife. It's fantastic.
You can feel the tension, can't you? You can feel that it is going to go at any minute.
How has he done that?
Again, it's just Holbein's absolute genius. I find it fascinating, though, that the knife, which really does shine, this lovely shiny, and you can see the sharpness of the knife, covers up the name of the merchant. And it must just be because he expected people to know who he was. This would have possibly hung in his home. It's a domestic portrait, so people looking at it would have known who he was. It's just we've lost his identity now.
OK, finally, Kate, your favourite, please, and why?
Now, I find this really difficult. I've got so many favourites around the exhibition, and I could tell you about all of them, but I think I'd like to tell you about Thomas Lestrange.
Please.
Who is not a household name. What we're looking at is a drawing of Thomas Lestrange. It's a preparatory drawing for a portrait which doesn't survive, but was recorded at Lestrange's residence of Hunstanton Hall really until the very early 20th century. Lestrange was a Norfolk gentleman, and he was probably drawn by Holbein in around 1536. And this is the most exquisite use of chalks. If you look closely, you can see how he's smudged the chalk for the velvet of the hat, so you've got the texture. How he's left a blank piece in the hair, so suddenly you get the shine of this wonderful hair. You get the different colours in his beard. And that incredibly fine work around his nose and eyes, and just that tiny dot of blue watercolour in the eyes. That's the only watercolour in the whole of the drawing, just to catch those wonderful, almost steely grey eyes. You can see how Holbein has smudged away chalk to create that sense of a collar, a slightly off-white collar, and he's added a little bit of white there to brighten it on the pink background. Now, Lestrange himself is absolutely fascinating. He and his wife Anne kept a really meticulous set of accounts, which tell us about their lives in Norfolk, about who their visitors were, what they ate, what they bought. He buys a black velvet hat. And I don't know if that's the hat, but he buys a black velvet hat. So you get this sense of the household coming to life and this sense of a bustling household. He had jugglers visiting, they had minstrels visiting, trumpeters came and played to their dinner guests. But also, there's always this question, how did Holbein win his commissions? And it must have been through word of mouth. It must have been people looking at these wonderful works and thinking, I want one of those. And if you look around the gallery, you start to realise the network of which Lestrange was a part. Just over there are Baron and Lady Vaux, and they are his brother and sister-in-law.
Okay.
And they commissioned their portraits probably in 1535. So it might be that Lestrange saw those and wanted one of his own. Behind you, you have William Parr, who's his wife's nephew. You have Richard Southwell, who's a neighbour, one of the leading men in the region. You've got the Boleyns, you've got the Sheltons, who are recorded coming to visit. And so you get the sense of this network of these conversations that aren't recorded in the document, allowing Holbein to gain his success more and more and more. So Lestrange, to me, gives us a way into Holbein's world and Holbein's ability to gain these requests for portraits, as well as being just a wonderful example of Holbein's work.
Have you found out anything new about Holbein through putting on this exhibition?
Yeah, there have been a few things. Personally, it's sort of just reinforced what a fantastic artist he is. And that wasn't new, but it's, I sort of discovered him afresh by just looking and looking and looking. There have been a few things that we've suggested in the labels, opening up debates. One is the drawing of John Fisher, which I do not believe is by Holbein. It's just not quite good enough. He's such a fantastic artist, and this is by someone who's handling media a little bit differently, but it is by someone who knows Holbein's work and is working on that pink paper. You'll see the drawing over there of the gentleman in the black hat. We've suggested that that's not Simon George, who it's always been catalogued as and thought to be a man called Simon George. We've suggested it might actually be the naval captain Sir George Cornwall, which becomes really interesting because Cornwall married in 1543. And this is probably a marriage portrait because the finished painting survives in Frankfurt. It's currently on display in their Holbein exhibition at the moment. And if it's a marriage portrait, we can date it to the last year of Holbein's life. And if you look, we've put the Frankfurt painting on the label. You can see how Holbein changed the composition between the drawing and the finished painting. He changed the beard, he changed the clothes. And it shows Holbein constantly refining and refining and refining. It shows him as a perfectionist, therefore, to the end of his life.
Well, all that remains for me to say is thank you so much for your time today, Kate. We've had a fantastic time, and what an exhibition.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you so much. Listeners, you really have to come along and see it. This is on until the 14th of April, I think.
Until the 14th of April.
So there's plenty of time.
And people who buy their tickets from Royal Collection Trust can come back for a year. They can get those tickets converted into a year pass in the gallery, so you can come back as many times as you want.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks for joining us for this special bonus episode. If you're listening to this before the 14th of April 2024, you still have time to visit, and we wholeheartedly recommend you do. Join us next time. Bye!
Bye!